Hi there, another little tidbit teaching for you. Received an email based on the last post that I did with the last little video, and it raised a couple of questions for me. They were asking for clarification on something, and it made me ask this question of myself, which I have now posed, done the research, and I'm going to present to you my results very quickly here. The question was basically, how many statutes can you point to and say there it is, the term human being in the statute? And how many statutes can you point to and say, there it is, private person in the statute? And how many statutes can you point to and say, there it is, natural person is in that statute? And this is the kicker, is how many statutes can you point to and say, there it is, man, the term man being used? I don't remember ever having seen man being used in a statute. It's almost always person or private person or natural person, or very rarely a human being. I didn't remember seeing too many of those. So I decided to go looking, and ultimately it comes down to the question at the end, which is, why would lawmakers and draftsmen use one term over the other at certain specific times? Why would they choose to use a private person in a statute instead of human being, or a natural person instead of private person, or man instead of any of the above? It raises a good question as to what is the minute differences or large differences between those terms. Or is it just being used to confuse people by redefining those terms for specific uses and having them, you know, hop around from place to place? Now, the term person is used a whole lot, and in some cases it actually is redefined to a specific purpose for a particular statute for that word person. And it carries different definitions in other statutes. So some statutes will redefine the word person, some won't, and general meaning will attach to it. So let's take a look and find out these 4 questions here, what there is. All right, I did Canley, and you can see here it's the Canada federal statutes. How many times does it appear in federal law, the term human being? It's in 17 forms of regulation. 17 statutes and regulations, 10 statutes, 7 regulations, it shows up. And you can see it in the body here. Assisted Human Reproduction Act. Outside the body of a human being or any other thing. I wonder what that other thing might be. Deceased, living or deceased human being, fetus or embryo. Disease in human beings, animals or plants. At least they're making a distinction between animals and human beings, because there's some theories from the US where they're treating us all as animals under their laws so they can do things to us. Food and Drug Act, food and drink for human beings, the care of human beings or animals during pregnancy. Well, maybe that is either or, I don't know. Anyways, questions for people to investigate. Canadian Multiculturalism Act, all human beings are equal. That's interesting. Usually it's all persons or whatever, but there it is. All human beings are equal, but it's related to the Multiculturalism Act. So you can see that, oh, here we go. British Columbia Turkey Marketing Board. Person means any human being, not natural person or private person or man, but human being. And this is, I believe, a very rare definition of the word person, to use it and join it with human being. So why did they do that? That's federal again. Accessible exceptions, committees, regulations, right? Exposure to human beings, animals, and plants. Animals and human beings. Lots of it related to animals, acts that have animals in them. Is that a clue? Museums Act, among all organisms, including human beings. So you can see that human beings does show up, and multiple acts, and there's only one page, so 17 examples of it. Look at, there's even a human being in the Excise Tax Act, federal. So, and it's again related to human beings or animals. All right, so interesting. So let's look at human beings in British Columbia. You can look in your own jurisdiction, of course. It shows up in 7 different acts, and it's 5 statutes and, 2 regulations. So Ecological Reserve Act, complete system composed of human beings, other animals, and plants. There's that animals and plants thing again. Motion picture regulations, genital, etc. So basically no visual sex acts allowed between human beings on their motion picture laws. Sexual conduct, all right. Community charter. Animal means any member of the animal kingdom other than a human being. Kind of sounds like they're making human beings under the animal category, but they're creating an exception in this case. Family Law Act, human being. So there we go, injury or death to a human being under the Motor Vehicle Act. Now, they generally use the word person in the Motor Vehicle Act, so this is a specific use of human being. So that's interesting. And then we look at natural person. Again, we're going back to the federal statutes and regulations it's under 80 statutes and 44 regulations uses the term natural person. And as you can see, we did this just a little bit the other day. The term natural person is used multiple times, lots of it with insurance, affiliate banking regulation, insurance, trust and loan, insurance, prepaid products regulation. The institution must, on issuance of a prepaid payment product to a person other than a natural person. So you see, a person is not always the same thing as a natural person. There's a distinction, a separation here. A person other than a natural person. Financing, Museums Act. This act, the rights, powers, and privileges of a natural person. So this is, the rights, powers, and privileges is a relatively new thing in Canadian law. They went through and gave legislated, created bodies the rights, powers, and privileges of a natural person, which my interpretation after having studied in it when it first came into the law was that a legislative body can only do what it is legislated to do through its own act and through its regulations, etc. If it wants to do something other than what it's expressly permitted to do, it has to go and get an actual law written for them to have permission to do it, which also included things like making contracts for buying land and various other things. So by giving the capacity, rights, and powers of or privileges of a natural person, they're not being made into a natural person. They're only getting the rights, capacities, powers, and privileges that a natural person naturally has and doesn't have to have it given to them. So the corporate entities have to have these rights and powers and privileges given to them by legislation. A natural person has them by right. So registered products, Canada Pension Plan, certificate of registrations, here land claim settlements. Again, it's all about the rights, powers, and privileges, getting these given to these agencies. This is an interesting one. We're going to be doing a Bank Act one soon, which the public has access to, at which a company carries on a business with the public and opens or initiates the opening of a deposit account through natural persons. Only natural persons can open certain types of bank accounts, and like I said, we've got an upcoming seminar on that. So again, you can see there's 5 pages of stuff here through a natural person, again, through a natural person with regards to bank acts. So you can see that natural person is used in specific types of acts and the rights, powers, and privileges. Now BC, natural person, it's in 54 total, 51 statutes and 3 regulations it shows up in. See, natural person actually shows up in the BC Income Tax Act, and it has to do with regards to trusts, strata property, giving the capacity of a natural person, community charter, natural person powers, game farm regulation, if the licensee is a natural person, person, Family Compensation Act. See this definition? Person means a natural person. Again, this is a specific and unique definition of the word person, which is not defined in most instances in most acts. You'll also find this in the Bank Act of Canada, that person is also defined as a natural person. Now, statutorily, that means that because they went to the trouble, the legislature went to the trouble of defining the word person to mean natural person in one act, and it didn't do it in another act, that's evidence that they purposely meant to exclude natural person from the definition of the word person in that other act. So if they don't define person means natural person in an act in the definition section, then for that act, for that section, it does not include natural person within the meaning. It's the, I believe, proper interpretation of the way the acts are done. So you can see natural person, a lot of it is being given the powers and capacity. Now look at this. The university was given the powers and capacity of a natural person. The previous definition was the rights, powers, and privileges of the natural person. So a slightly different way of wording it. No privileges, just powers and capacity. And the society has the powers of a natural person of full capacity. Full capacity being everything that a natural person naturally has at law, etc. So a sheet act, chicken marketing scheme. So again, you can see it in a bunch of different places. Now, if we look at private person, how many times does it show up in federal law? It shows up in 10 statutes, 9 statutes and 1 regulation. We went over this the other day. I won't go over it in depth. But again, here's the samples. It shows up. Now, we also looked the other day the fact that they declared in the bi-jural terminology record that private person was obsolete, but here it is in federal law related to property issues. Private person, how many times does it show up in provincial law? It shows up in 5 statutes, no regulations. A contract between private persons. A contract between private persons. A contract between private persons. Gee, I wonder what they're talking about there. All right. Now, the separation between instance of the government, municipality, or private person. Properties owned by private persons. Authority is liable in tort for damages for which, if it were a private person of full age and capacity. So again, this is related to property damage. See this regulation or this stuff going on with regards to private person and property? Corporations shall not within district sell or supply water to private persons or corporations or otherwise in bulk, but the corporation may sell, and on and on and on. So again, it is there, and again, they're using private person, not natural person. And here's that distinction with regards to the Bank Act I mentioned. This is the Bank Act today. Person means a natural person, an entity, or a personal representative. So within the Bank Act, it has included the definition of natural person. Again, because they've done this specifically in the Bank Act and they don't do it in another act, that other act has excluded natural person from the definition of the word person. I mean, this is a key concept. And if you'll look at, just on an additional little note, you notice the Bank Act here has a preamble, all right? And it has an enacting clause from Her Majesty. Now this is going back to yesterday's webinar with regards to the fact that there is general applicability laws and limited applicability laws. General applicability is to everybody, all people. It's creating access, or it's creating some type of law that everybody is equally applied to. And a limited applicability law is only applicable to people who become subject to it through some sort of application process. The Bank Act, I see it as a general applicability, and part of that example is they've included a natural person in it. The other thing is they've actually got a preamble and an enacting clause. You find most acts that are put out by provincial and federal legislatures do not have enacting clauses, at least in BC. I have noticed Saskatchewan and Alberta almost always have enacting clauses. So this is a general applicability law creating access to the banking system for all natural persons and private persons. And what they do is they try and deny us access to the private bank accounts we have the right to access. And I'll be doing a webinar shortly in order to show you how to set up a private bank account and ensure that it is for the benefit and the use of a private person and not some corporate entity or taxpayer. So now this last one was man. I thought, geez, man, I've never seen it in a act anywhere, and so I decided to go looking for it. We're talking about British Columbia. It's actually in 5 statutes and 15 regulations, but many of them are derivatives of the word man, not man itself. For instance, Hanson Man and Motion Tour, okay, we can ignore that one. Manning Park, Old Man Lake, we can ignore that one. Isle of Man, we can ignore. Man-made fiber, we can ignore. Here we go. Designation and exemption regulation. Wildlife Act. All right. So it's regard to birds or its supplements which are native to Canada or the United States of America were not introduced by man. Kept in captivity for the use of man. So again, I've never seen this before with regards to the man. We can forget that one. We can forget that one. We forget that one. Here we go. Fisheries Act. Fish that has in or upon it bacteria of a kind or quantity considered by the ministry to be hazard to human health or substance toxic to man. Now, are they making a separation between man and human here? I don't know, but why would they use the 2 different terms in the same sentence? So again, some interesting questions being raised by looking for this. Man-made ponds we can ignore. There we go. It's Law and Equity Act. Married woman as for a married man. So woman and man rarely show up, but it's in the Law and Equity Act with regards to I'm guessing, common law or possibly civil law marriages. Man-made fiber, here we go. Fish inspection regulations, again with the animal type stuff. Aesthetically offensive to man, not to person, natural person, or human being. All right. So there we go. There's a few examples of actually using the term man in its acts, and that's in British Columbia. If we go to the federal, we have statute and regulations. It's in 29 statutes and regulations, 110. But again, many of them can be ignored, man-made. And by the way, there is a way to drop these out using this little gadget here. But I never figured it out in time, so if anyone wants to figure it out, go for it. Here we go. Application of Defense Services Pension Act to the Special Force. The Defense Services Pension Act shall not apply to any officer or man who is appointed. Officer or man. Officer or man. That's an interesting use of it. Man-made we can ignore. Let's see. Here we go. Pay and Allowances Regulations. Appropriations Act. Consolidated Regulations. Allowances means subsistence allowance and the marriage allowance authorized to be paid to a man pursuant to regulations under the what? The National Defense Act. Oh, gee, we're back into the soldier stuff like the one previously. Oh, look, another soldier one here. Notwithstanding anything in this act, a man means, and this is the definition that's really interesting, okay? Man means chief petty officer, leading seaman, able seaman, and ordinary seaman and equivalent in the Royal Canadian Navy. Interesting. Time served as an officer, non-commissioned officer, or man on active service. Isn't that interesting? The main use of the word man is with regards to military acts. Here we go. Coal mining occupational hazard. A man car. Oh, that's something inside a mine. Never mind. Here we go. Fish. Or is propagated by man in a fish culture. Propagated by man. Okay, so fishing and military. Civil Service Insurance Act, where the insured is a married man, unmarried man, married man. Okay. Manned installation. So again, there's more pages there for you to look through, but I found it very interesting that man in the Federal Act is associated with defense issue, military stuff. It's in Defense Services Pension 14 times. And time served as officer, non-commissioned officer, or man on active duty. Really? Here's the definition of man in Part 2. Now, again, the way definitions work, or any type of thing, it says in this act, subject to the modification set out in this part, applies with respect to the Royal Canadian Navy. So the definitions for Section 37, and only in Section 37, they've given the man definition down here. So this definition only applies in this act, but isn't that an interesting definition they got there? Pay, and in the case of a man, which is different than an officer, all right, service in case of a man does not include time served without pay in the force. What? Interesting. All right, so we can go through here. Man means a commission. So this part, Section 41, in this act, man means these things. All right, man is here and defined. Officer, service. I mean, go to town and figure this one out. It looks like their definition of man in the military is unique. I haven't found that anywhere else. So anyways, taking me back to the question, why would the lawmakers and draftsmen use one term over the other at certain specific times and those certain specific subject matters? So again, just food for thought. Anybody else who wants to follow up on this research and come to some conclusions and make some suggestions, please do. Comment below, send an email, share your research.